And for more on this first face-to-face meeting between Xi and Trump, we're joined by Dali Yang, professor at the University of Chicago. It seems as though both sides kind of downplaying the summit, saying there's not going to be a lot in the way of deliverables, describing it as more of a get-to-know-you session. It is reminiscent of Sunnyland's, that summit in California, where Obama and Xi met, the shirt-sleeve diplomacy, but many say that the relationship kind of went downhill from there. Is this a chance for a reset in relations between the United States and China?
Definitely. Of course, the Chinese side and many others recognize that when the two presidents get to meet outside of Washington or the capitals, usually they have done very well. In fact, going back in the history of the U.S.-China relations, that has been the case, whether it's Hangzhou or Texas or Sunnylands. I think actually this gets the atmosphere back in the warmer kind of setting rather than the austere kind of diplomatic confrontational approach. And of course, the Chinese side is actually very wary after the rocky start to this relationship. But again, that's not unusual with new presidents being inaugurated in the United States. They are pretty used to that. So we've got some professionals on both sides handling this, trying to get it back on track. And the relationship, I do think, actually is getting back on track with this meeting.
We were looking at imagery now as we're talking to you, and it looks like they're very comfortable with one another as they meet there in Mar-a-Lago. The U.S. president, though, has had a really rough patch since his inauguration, numerous setbacks. Of course, the most recent, the failure on getting through this repeal and replace legislation on health care. So how important is the summit for him in terms of it going well? What's at stake for him? Which one has more at stake?
Well, for President Trump, he may have a little bit more at stake. In fact, he deliberately treated about how tough it would be to be bargaining with the Chinese. And of course, he's always emphasized that the Chinese are good negotiators and so on. So he's actually downplayed expectations. But there's no doubt that he would like this meeting to go well from his perspective to show the Americans that he can have some deliverables. And I do think actually the Chinese side came to Florida expecting that they want to offer certain things, and so that actually the U.S. side can claim some victory. But on the other side, the Chinese can also go home and say, number one, we've righted the relationship. The U.S. continues to adhere to the one China policy. And of course, there are a variety of other issues that we can work on together, even though there are some differences. Managing conflicts is the fundamental strategy for the Chinese. They don't want to have conflicts overflowing and ruining the relationship. They want to contain the conflicts while focusing on the common interests.
These two countries have very different views on what to do with the DPRK, though. The U.S. wants this tougher stance. China is advocating diplomacy. Do you think there's going to be much headway there?
Not as much. This is a much more intractable issue for both countries. And I think actually the two countries are getting closer. There is significant, palpable public dissatisfaction with North Korea. And of course, over time, more and more Chinese have come to the realization that North Korea has gotten off to some extent off the Chinese orbit and has become too wayward for the good of the Chinese interests. So in that sense, actually, it's clear that China has not shown a lot of warmth towards Kim Jong-un. In fact, President Xi Jinping has yet to see, to be willing to visit or to actually be visited by Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader. So in that sense, that strained relationship shows that there may be a more common interest between China and the United States with regard to the DPRK. But at the same time, China definitely also doesn't want to see simply the U.S. simply coming into the Korean Peninsula and taking on the issue unilaterally. But it's not obvious that there is an easy unilateral solution to the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, we've got about 30 seconds. I'm sure they'd like to see THAAD gone as well. Let's talk a little bit about trade. Anything going to happen there?
Yeah, I do think actually China is quite used to trade discussions. And of course, they can have a lot to offer. They can argue about how actually China doesn't make as much money out of that surplus that the U.S. claims China enjoys. But at the same time, China can buy things from the U.S. market, Boeing airplanes, grains, and other things as well. But at the same time, there is growing Chinese investments in the U.S., and that creates American jobs. And I think the Chinese leadership would be emphasizing that as well.
All right, Dali Yang joining us from Chicago. Thanks so much for your analysis.